It sometimes seems to me that, more often than not, dictators and tyrants who have undoubtedly committed terrible crimes against humanity simply go unpunished. In fact, not only do they go unpunished, they often get to live out the rest of their lives in relative luxury, thanks to the loot that they got hold of during their time in power. You don't believe me? Well, how about this? Idi Amin, one of the bloodiest butchers of recent times, lived out his days in comfort in Saudi Arabia. Pol Pot, a man responsible for the deaths of millions in the Cambodian genocide, died peacefully of natural causes, surrounded by his family and comrades. Walter Rauff, notorious SS colonel responsible for at least 90,000 deaths, lived out a cosy, peaceful retirement in Chile. And Nigerian despot Sani Abacha died of a heart attack, having spent the night with 3 prostitutes and a bottle of Viagra. However, not everyone gets away with it quite so comfortably. Sometimes these brutal men meet brutal ends, and sometimes we really do get what's coming to us. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, or Il Duce as he was known, was one of the most iconic figures of the Second World War. With his thrusting jawline, shaved head and theatrical mannerisms, the Italian dictator is instantly recognisable. Sometimes portrayed as a kind of a second-rate Hitler wannabe and an inept commander whose military misadventures invariably ended in failure, make no mistake, Mussolini was no clown. He was a brutal man, and when his downfall came, it too would be bloody and brutal. Violence came early in Mussolini's life. Although an intelligent boy, he was prone to fighting and bullying. At age 10, he was expelled from boarding school for stabbing a fellow pupil. He took to duelling, and apparently had over 100 duelling scars from his fights and battles. As a young man, he was in fact a staunch socialist, but Mussolini was outraged at the pacifist stance taken by the left during World War I. He believed that war was the precursor to overthrowing the elite, and that therefore any chance to fight should be taken up. So, losing faith with the left, he swung to the far right, becoming a fascist and rising quickly to the head of the Italian right wing. His physique was impressive, and his style of oratory, staccato and repetitive, was superb. His attitudes were highly theatrical, his opinions were contradictory, his facts were often wrong, and his attacks were frequently malicious and misdirected. But his words were so dramatic, his metaphors so apt and striking, his vigorous, repetitive gestures so extraordinarily effective that he rarely failed to impose his mood. By 1922, Mussolini had garnered support from a broad section of the Italian public, who saw the liberal ruling class as corrupt and weak. He and his black shirts marched on Rome, and following an offer from the king to form a government, he took control. The Italian public, who were longing for a strong leader who could bring order to the chaos of Italian politics, welcomed this new strongman to the helm. But the order came at a price. By 1925, civil liberties had been restricted, opposition parties were banned, free speech had been crushed, and Mussolini's secret police kept the population in check. The new dictator soon showed that he wasn't adverse to using brutal measures when it suited him. During the Italian conquest of Ethiopia, he used mustard gas against the civilian population, and the Italian army were brutal in their conquest of Libya. When Hitler gained power in Germany, Mussolini was the first to sign alliance treaties with Nazi Germany, creating what became known as the Axis powers. Mussolini's fall from grace really began around 1943, having committed Italy to fight alongside Hitler, only then to suffer a series of humiliating military defeats at the hands of the Allied forces. Mussolini's popularity was definitely on the wane. Losing faith in his military ability and seeing nothing but more defeats ahead of them, the long-suffering Italian people and the Italian monarchy decided it was time for a more moderate approach. In July of 1943, Mussolini was officially removed from office by the Italian king and the Grand Council. Now, refusing to believe that anyone would actually move against him, Mussolini carried on as usual, but after his next meeting with the king, he was in fact arrested. To keep him out of the hands of the Germans, he was taken to a remote hotel high in the Abruzzi Mountains, and here he was kept under guard while the new Italian government was being formed. Upon hearing of Mussolini's political downfall and imprisonment, Hitler's first reaction was basically to do nothing. He'd never really needed Mussolini or the Italian army. Indeed, earlier in the war, the Italian forces had to be repeatedly rescued by German forces, so it wasn't like Mussolini was an invaluable military ally or anything like that. However, the idea of a neutral Italian government allowing the Allies to just march right up through Italy to the Austrian border was completely unthinkable. And so, Mussolini was rescued from his lofty prison. German glider troops crash-landed onto the mountain slopes above the Hotel Campo Imperatore, and in a daring raid, freed Mussolini and flew him back to Munich. With the support of Nazi Germany, Mussolini was reinstalled as Il Duce, albeit in a somewhat limited form in the north of Italy. His new government, the Repubblica Sociale Italiana, was little more than a sham, a puppet government which had no real power other than what the Germans allowed it. However, Mussolini took advantage of whatever power he had, rounding up and executing many of those who had been involved in ousting him, and this included his own son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano. Mussolini also continued his earlier policies of deporting Italian Jews to Germany, executing political opponents, and the violent suppression of any show of public opposition to his rule. But time was running out. The tide of the war had changed, and as Allied soldiers fought their way up through Italy, Mussolini knew that his days as Il Duce were numbered. The writing was on the wall, and so Mussolini, with his mistress Clara Petacci and a handful of loyal followers, made a break for the border, aiming for Switzerland. Travelling in Petacci's Alfa Romeo sports car, which was disguised as a Spanish diplomatic vehicle, Mussolini, who was now dressed as a German soldier, hoped that he could sneak out of Italy and into Switzerland. Once there, he could claim asylum and live out his days in exile. That's what he was hoping for, but it was not to be. The convoy that he was travelling in was stopped at Lake Como, where Italian partisans captured the fleeing fascist leaders. Mussolini must have known what awaited him. His face was like wax and his stare glassy, but somehow blind. I read utter exhaustion, but not fear. Mussolini seemed completely lacking in will, spiritually dead. Mussolini and Petacci were held overnight in a local farmhouse, while the partisans decided what to do with them. Possibly fearing another rescue attempt by German troops, the decision was made to execute the pair. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon the following day, Mussolini and Petacci were driven into town, hauled out of the truck, stood up against this wall outside the Villa Belmonte, and shot. What happened next must be one of the most grotesque instances of what can happen to the bodily remains of a once all-powerful leader. The corpses of Mussolini and Clara Petacci, along with 16 bodies of other executed fascists, were loaded onto a truck and driven to the Piazzale Loreto Square in Milan. Once there, the bodies were dumped in a heap on the forecourt of a petrol station, a grisly spectacle that left no doubt that Il Duce was dead. As the news spread, thousands gathered, and the furious crowd began to beat the bodies, subjecting Mussolini's corpse to every degradation imaginable. Wikipedia somewhat dryly states that, quote, Mussolini's face was disfigured by beatings. I mean, to be honest, from the photographs, after the crowd had finished with him, is completely unrecognisable. The face, which once adorned posters and paintings hung in every public building and square, now resembled something more like a rubber Halloween mask or like a ripe, squashed melon. It's horrible. One woman pulled out a revolver and shot his body 5 times, screaming 5 bullets for 5 lost sons. The crowd wanted to see for themselves the fallen leader, and they screamed, "Higher, higher, we can't see them, string them up, to the hooks, like pigs." And so the bodies were strung up by their feet from the ironwork of the Esso petrol station canopy, while the baying crowd continued to pelt them with stones and rotten vegetables, all the while screaming insults at the remains of the once venerated leader. It was this terrible image which adorned the front pages of many newspapers in the following days. How the mighty can fall, eh? At about 2 in the afternoon, the American military authorities took the bodies down, where they were delivered to the city mortuary for an autopsy. An American military photographer took this opportunity to arrange Mussolini and Petacci in a macabre pose, linked arm in arm, like sweethearts on a first date. And so ended the reign of Italy's Il Duce, a brutal end for a brutal man. Now, just a couple of points in closing. Shortly after the burial of the disfigured body, it was dug up again and hidden in a monastery outside of Milan. Although the authorities tracked the body down, they decided to hide it again to prevent his grave from becoming a site of focus for neo-fascist groups. And for 11 years, the whereabouts of the remains of Il Duce remained a state secret. However, in 1957, Italian Prime Minister Oddone Zolli had Mussolini's remains brought out of hiding and officially interred in the Mussolini family crypt at Predappio. To this day, his shrine continues to attract large numbers of curious visitors. Although the petrol station where Mussolini was strung up has long since vanished, online researchers have been able to determine the exact spot. Taking advantage of the numerous photographs of the Piazzale Loreto from that day, they have deduced that the space where Mussolini's body once hung is now occupied by a McDonald's restaurant. So if you're ever in Milan having a Big Mac on the Piazzale Loreto, ponder that you just might be sitting right in the spot where one of history's most recognisable dictators was once strung upside down from a petrol station canopy.